And we're going to continue on in this scientific vein as we introduce our first fireside discussion of the day on the future of science and knowledge between Tuomas Sandholm and Max Jaderberg. Max is the Chief AI Officer at Isomorphic Labs, where he leads the research and application of machine learning for drug discovery, including the latest AlphaFold model. For those of you unfamiliar with AlphaFold, it's an incredible system originally developed by Google DeepMind, where Max previously worked, that uses state-of-the-art deep learning techniques to predict protein structures in 3D space. And this 3D element is vital here because proteins don't stay one-dimensional. To become functional, proteins must fold into complex three-dimensional shapes. And because a protein's shape relates closely to its function, understanding how proteins fold is key to not only understanding how organisms work, but also key to understanding how life itself works. To put into perspective just how challenging it is to predict protein structures, per Levinthal's paradox, any given protein could theoretically adopt something like 10 to the power of 300 different configurations, meaning that it would take longer than the age of the universe for a protein to fold into every configuration available to it, even if it attempted millions of configurations per second. But today, thanks to AlphaFold, we have 3D structures for nearly all of the human proteome. And just last week, Google DeepMind and Isomorphic Labs announced AlphaFold 3, a revolutionary new model that can predict the interactions and the structures of all life's molecules with unprecedented accuracy. Now, how has AlphaFold been able to achieve all of this? By treating protein prediction like a game, which leads us to the work of Tuomas Sandholm. Tuomas is a prolific professor and entrepreneur. Among his many accolades, he is perhaps best known as being the architect of Libratus, the first and only AI to ever beat top humans at, and now I need to see if I can get this right, heads up, no limit Texas Hold'em poker, which is the main benchmark for testing algorithms that solve imperfect information games. Now, imperfect information games are games where not all players have access to all information that's relevant to the game at all times. Card games like bridge and poker are perfect examples because the players can't see each other's cards. Now, there are many reasons why the AI field cares about imperfect information games, real-world application being one of them. And indeed, Tuomas is on a mission to prove that game theory is directly useful by applying computational game theory to many high-stakes defense settings. Tuomas has also applied his computer science research to medicine. Since 2010, his algorithms have been running the National Kidney Exchange for the United Network for Organ Sharing, which has resulted in over 10,000 life-saving kidney transplants in the US. So I'm sure you can agree that when it comes to the topic of the future of science and knowledge, we're in very safe hands. And I know Joel has been so incredibly excited to facilitate this conversation. So please give it up for Joel, Tuomas, and Max.
Hello again, folks. I hope you're not getting tired of me. I'm so excited for this conversation. We have two of the most legendary AI researchers on the planet here with us, and you just heard Lauren describe literally 10,000 lives saved by Tuomas here, which is quite incredible. And Max research is really pioneering in helping save lives in the future with the development of new medicines. Max, I thought I'd start off with you. It feels like a weird combo, first trying to solve Starcraft and then all of a sudden trying to solve medicine. How did you bridge that gap?
Yeah, we had great fun back at DeepMind, honing the whole world of deep learning to these amazing challenge domains. One of those was Starcraft. And I've essentially spent the last 10 years working on the deep learning toolbox. And deep learning is that foundational tech that's been behind all of this new AI revolution that we're seeing, behind transformers, diffusion models, large language models, generative models. So I've spent a lot of time working on those core methods. So things like developing generative models, and then how we model the world around us, and then also how we act in that world. And that's the whole space of reinforcement learning, so training agents to act in the world, or this modeled world. And at DeepMind, we used things like Starcraft or Go or chess as that domain to really test our algorithms in. But the really cool thing about deep learning is that those same fundamental methods and that toolbox, you can just apply it to problems in chemistry and biology. And so now at Isomorphic Labs for drug design, we're modeling this microscopic world of proteins and DNA and RNA in cells. And we're using our whole deep learning toolbox for that. And then we're going to be applying the whole world of things like reinforcement learning, how you act in the world, to work out how do we modulate those systems. So instead of spitting out actions in Starcraft like send troops over there to the enemy base, we're going to be spitting out molecules which are going to be binding to proteins to modulate a diseased protein. So that's sort of the connection here.
It's very intriguing. Can you tell us about the backstory behind AlphaFold? When did you decide that that was a goal worth pursuing, and what was it like in the early days?
Yeah, so AlphaFold is this breakthrough model that predicts the 3D structure of proteins. And proteins are the building blocks of life, and are the main things that are often implicated in disease. So understanding that 3D structure is really crucial. And crazily enough, AlphaFold, which was this amazing breakthrough, I'll come back to this. AlphaFold actually started as a hackathon project, right? Just can we throw deep learning, neural networks at the problem of protein folding? And from there spiraled into this many years research program, which led to AlphaFold 2. You can see along the bottom, this is the whole history of performance of protein folding in what's called CASP, which is this international blinded competition of can you fold proteins with a model. And you can see that for many, many years, performance was just steadily increasing. And then suddenly AlphaFold and AlphaFold 2 came along and completely blew everything out the water. And this was a real revolution in understanding proteins. And now, as of last week, we've got AlphaFold 3, which is a new model we've been developing, which takes these capabilities away from just modeling proteins to also modeling proteins and their interactions with other molecules like DNA, RNA, small molecules. You get beautiful structures like this, and it's really important because proteins don't act in isolation in the cell. They're part of these bigger pieces of molecular machinery interacting with DNA and RNA and other proteins and forming these amazing molecular machines and signaling pathways. And so really this new model allows us to understand so much more about these molecular machines, and then obviously that allows us to get a foot in to work out, okay, how do we modulate this system by designing a small molecule drug, for example?
And what was the moment where you figured that this might actually work out?
What was the moment? I think I saw at DeepMind just that amazing breakthrough in AlphaFold. I've also seen personally, time and time again, there were these seemingly impossible problems. I'd be at a conference and talk to someone, very big professors in the field, and we talk about Starcraft, and they'd be like, "Yeah, that's 10 years away." Or we talk about protein folding, yeah, "Oh, that's 20 years away." And I know we're sitting on the results internally that has already solved these problems or beat the human champion at this. And I've seen this time and time again. And I think AlphaFold 3 is another demonstration of that. And, it's not the end of the story. There's probably another half dozen at least AlphaFolds we need to crack to really have impact on drug design. But from what I can see, all the pieces are in place, and we've got to do a lot of innovation to keep it moving. But we really can get there with these models.
What do you think are the things that many consider to be 20 years away that are actually far closer?
I think where my headspace is currently at is this space of computational drug design. I think we've seen this first wave of AI for pharma, for drug design companies, doing a lot of what I would call local models, so fitting to small data sets, which means that there's limited ways you can apply these models. I think what we're now seeing is we can actually get what I would call foundational models for biology, for biochemistry, for chemistry. So these are models where you can train them on a single task, and then amazingly, and this is sort of the phenomenon of modern AI, amazingly, you train them on a single task, and they can be applied to so many different downstream things. We see the same thing with AlphaFold 3. We train it on structure prediction, predict the 3D coordinates of atoms, but out of that, we get so many capabilities, like being able to understand how strongly things will interact. We can use this model for protein design. We can work out where, transcription factors, which are proteins that read DNA, what parts of DNA particular proteins will bind to. So these are the sort of things that I think, a lot of people haven't necessarily had much belief that they're coming, but I can definitely see that, we're just on the cusp of this now.
So that's some similarities to the progress we saw in language. What's so different about this domain? Why can't you just deploy, GPT-4 on this specific application? What changes have you had to make in the architecture for solving protein folding specifically?
Yeah, I wish we could just deploy GPT-4 or Gemini on this. It would make my job easier. But large language models are incredible. The amount of capabilities there is insane. They've sucked up the world's text data, now video data and audio data. And people are using large language models to, ask questions about science, and you can get some mileage out of that. But a lot of the data and knowledge in science is not stored in text. It's actually, the bits and numbers that are results of, wet experiments from the lab, or their sensor readings, or they're the results of simulations. They're not things that can be easily condensed into text. So, imagine, for example, taking the collision of two atoms from the Large Hadron Collider in CERN. All of the data, the gigabytes of data that comes out from the sensors of that, you can't just put that as text and run it through GPT-4. You need specialized neural networks and algorithms that can work with these particular data modalities, and that, crucially, you can also inject our current understanding of physics, of chemistry, of biology. We can inject that into these specialized architectures. So we still use the same fundamental pieces as large language models, but just re-engineered in quite different ways for these different data modalities. But I really hope one day, and I do believe that we'll be able to work out how to project these, all of the world's scientific data into, just tokens, and then we can, train them with large language models, and everything will just be a language model maybe one day.
Yeah, I think maybe actually it's incorrect to call them language models, and it's really, I don't know what the best way to describe them, but they're basically like token predictors of sorts. Which brings us over to your research, Tuomas. You've been obsessed with these imperfect information games. Basically, the types of games where we sit on some hidden information and we try to trick each other. Stuff like poker. And I remember, when you published a paper with Libratus, and you hadn't fully solved poker, but you created the best algorithm in the history, and the first one to defeat humans in poker. Why did you decide that poker was a worthwhile application of your research?
Well, there's kind of two things. One is that why imperfect information games in general, and there I would say that most real-world interactions are imperfect information games. There's at least one other agent out there, be it another human or a company or whatever. So they're not single-agent interactions. And the other is that there's imperfect information. Most real-world settings aren't things like chess, where everything is nicely laid out on the board and you know everything. And so that's kind of coming from the real-world motivation. I think that this type of technology is really important and broadly applicable. Then why specifically poker therein? Well, partly it's because poker has been the main benchmark in game theory since the founding of game theory in 1921. So when Emile Borel wrote his first paper and later book on two-player zero-sum games, his motivating application wasn't chess or anything like that. It was poker. And they had very small poker games as their benchmarks, but still, game theory has always been interested in poker. So I thought it would be nice if in my lab we could actually finally get to superhuman level in that. And third, it wasn't really my choice. The AI community had already picked that benchmark 12 years before I started.
And so I think we might. Do we have any poker players in the audience? Up with a hand. Yeah, we have a couple. So we might need some hacks here. So what did you learn from Libratus in terms of tactics that we could actually steal?
Okay, I learned so much, and I didn't used to even know the rules of Texas Hold'em when I started. So for me, this wasn't a love of poker at all. Now it has become a little bit of that. But some of the things I learned, well, I learned a lot of the same things that were already in the textbooks, but that's not that interesting. So Libratus, without reading a single textbook and without seeing any data how any human had ever played, figured all of this out by just self-play. So I'm not going to talk about the same things that were already known. I'll talk about the things that are different. So for example, limping. The textbooks say that you should never limp. And no matter which AI we built, which version, we have always been limping 8 to 12%. So that's a big difference compared to the human poker knowledge that had been accrued over hundreds of years.
What is limping?
Limping means that if you're, let's say, two-player poker, for example, when you're the big blind, I'm the small blind, it's my turn to move first, I just call. I don't fold and I don't bet. That's a weird move because it says that, okay, I'm putting money into the pot and I'm telling you I have a weak hand. So the risk is that you'll mow me over later.
Please don't limp us. We're giving these tactics in good faith. So when you started thinking about how that could be applied in the real world, what were sort of the initial applications that you saw? We solved poker here. How could we apply it into the real world?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that the actual exact algorithms of poker. We're working on other things in academia to push these techniques forward. For example, in dark chess, which is much bigger and more complicated than poker. But imperfect information game solving in general, I think has a lot of applications in a lot of different settings. But when I think about the applications that I wanted to pick for strategy robot and strategic machines first, I started from two-player zero-sum games for a couple of reasons. One is that then the prescriptions are so clear because I can play that strategy and I cannot be exploited. So even if my opponent plays something that's irrational or surprising, more surprising than I would expect, they cannot hurt me. So the game theoretic prescriptions are very strong there, unlike they are in general sum games or multiplayer games. So for the applications, we started from that just because the power of game theory is at its height in those games.
And what's so different about the algorithms there? If you just prompted, if we take the GPT, for example, again, why couldn't it play an imperfect information game?
Yeah, I don't think large language models, or let's say generative models in general, can actually play games well. So they may be able to play games as well as humans, maybe even a little bit better, but they can never play games, even perfect information games, as well as something that's customized to that. It really requires search. And if I think about all of the thousands of techniques that we've developed over the last 20 years for imperfect information games, the one subfamily of techniques that's given the biggest bang for the buck is imperfect information game sub-game solving. And that is really what has gotten a lot of the bang. And that type of reasoning is very hard to do by just reading something. You really have to have custom algorithms for doing the reasoning on the fly.
And back to you then, Max. How do you think these systems will be augmented by tree search? So we spoke previously about them sort of outputting the next token, and it's almost as if we're like stopping them right when they get to think. And if we give them more time to think, these models could be a lot more capable. So do you see a future where we sort of augment these models with more tree search and similar algorithms?
Yeah, I mean, these are some of the questions probably at the frontier of large language model research. At the moment, these language models, they spit out one token at a time. This is sort of on the level of a character or a subword. So you're spitting out almost one word at a time what you're going to create. And imagine if you're trying to write down, solve a problem or a very long equation where the word over here at the end really depends on the next word that you're going to spit out. you've already got to have in your head as this model where you're going to go with this whole sentence at this point in time, which means you're limiting your compute to just this history and not everything in between. So there's a lot of people who are thinking about, okay, how can we do maybe better the next step prediction? One way to do that is with search, where you could roll out a whole sentence of words and many different futures of that possible sentence, and then go and have a look at them and score them by how good you think they are, and then back up the tree, and maybe that helps you. Another whole line is actually using what's called diffusion modeling to do language generation. So diffusion modeling is a whole different type of technique that's often associated with image generative models, things like Midjourney, for example, or Stable Diffusion. And there, instead of looking at the next token, you're looking at the whole sentence out in front of you and gradually denoising, so getting a sharper and sharper representation of that sentence over many time steps. But the nice thing about that is that you're reasoning about that whole sentence at the same time. Saying this, no one's quite cracked it, and the thing that is scaling really well and working really well is this next token prediction. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see where the field goes.
And so how can we get new science using these models? Now we've effectively trained them on all human knowledge, and I think what you saw with Thomas in your work is, you kind of removed the human knowledge and you just gave it the rules and it figured that out. Is there a way for us to do something similar so that we can go beyond using existing knowledge and retrieving that towards developing entirely new science?
I think this is one of the central paradoxes of machine learning and AI in some sense, because these models work by training them on the data that we already have. So this is all the existing knowledge in the world we train these models on, and then somehow we're expecting them to generalize to be able to predict new stuff about the world. But the crazy thing is this does actually work. I think the starkest example in my mind where I was super convinced by this was back in 2016 with AlphaGo. This was DeepMind's Go playing neural network. And there was this amazing moment during the championship match with Lee Sedol. We call it Move 37. It was a Go move that stunned the commentators and the players around the world, not because it was so brilliant, but because no one could work out why the hell it was good. And then the game carries on a little bit, and a few steps later, it suddenly transpires that actually that move 37 was the critical move that created this beautiful structure on the Go board that won AlphaGo the match. So that's an example of creating completely new knowledge, and this is in the game of Go, which humanity has studied for thousands of years, right? So we know this is possible. How is almost a little bit of a mystery to me. There's lots of things we can do with our neural networks to help them generalize better. And I think, I don't think we really know how this works. I could speak for ages about all these techniques. I do think, going back to search and the notion of verification with search, I think this is probably one of the critical things that can help. And maybe Thomas, you have a view on that.
Yeah, I think there are many kinds of AI, and if I just bucket it into three as an example on the fly here, so there's this kind of deep learning that's using historical data, and then there's the optimization problem, where you formalize your problem as an optimization problem, and there AI search, whether it's tree search or integer programming, will actually sometimes construct solutions that are completely novel. And then there's a kind of simulation-based learning, where you have some sort of simulator of the world, be it, let's say, in poker or military settings. You have a simulator, and then the AI does it in self-play. So there's no constraint there then that it's going to play like a human or has the limitations that humans have and things that have been written on the web or in books. So to me, the creativity is best in those kinds of applications where we don't rely on data. And I'm seeing in a lot of applications at Strategy Robot that there isn't enough data. There isn't enough data for special applications because they're so maybe secretive or rare that not a lot has been written about them. And even in applications where a lot has been written about them, like poker, we see that a lot of the stuff that was written about was actually wrong.
Which is fascinating. We spoke with Daphne about that as well. Is actually what we're trying to do in when training these models is remove a lot of the human knowledge. Because if we train it on human knowledge, we also teach the system to overlook some of the patterns, because humans have overlooked those patterns in the past. So if we look at it, GPT-4 has been out for over a year. It has an IQ of 155. It's like a quite stellar model still. Why do you think we haven't seen more like economic disruption from these models yet?
Well, I think that we are going to see a lot of economic disruption, because a lot of the things that people do today, a lot of people do, are very simple, and that is going to get disrupted. But when it comes to these real expert things, I think we're going to need expert AI that's going to generate its own knowledge. It can't be relying on the limited knowledge that humans have created so far.
What do you think, Max? What's sort of holding us back in your domain from developing medicines faster?
I think because these are machine learning models, they will suffer from things like hallucinations. Like what are hallucinations? Well, it's really just the model getting something wrong, right? The accuracy of these models are amazing, but they're not perfect, so they will make mistakes. But that doesn't mean that they're completely useless, right? I think everyone's probably familiar with like making a mistake with your sat nav. I've been caught in the tunnel system of Stockholm because of taking the wrong turn that my sat nav told me to. Actually, the way you're meant to mitigate that is just occasionally you just look up at the real world and look at the road signs, and it's exactly that same sort of concept we have to do with our machine learning models, whether it's GPT-4 for a specific application or AlphaFold for a specific application. You trust them a lot, but you can't trust them fully. But there's this amazing thing that actually to verify an answer, whether it's correct or not, is often a huge amount easier than generating the answer itself. There's so many problems that line that. So, you just have to look up occasionally, back to the real world. What does that mean? Do a real experiment, get a few cheap bits of information from a person or from the lab or something like that, and suddenly you can turbocharge, your traditional process by using AI. It's not fully relied on it, but it's sort of 90% along the way.
And so, if there's one lesson we can sort of learn from the history of AI, is these specialized models very often get outperformed by the more general models. So why can't we just chill for a bit and wait for AGI and then have it solve all of these like specialized problems? Like, why does it actually make sense to build bespoke models for these given applications rather than waiting for AGI?
Yeah, I don't think the AGI without the specialized techniques will actually ever get there. If we ever get to AGI, it will include these specialized things, like, for example, engines for strategic reasoning. We're going to have those. And maybe they're called by LLMs, so you can have a natural language interface if you like, in some applications, maybe not. You're going to have special engines for recommender systems. LLMs today can do recommendation, but they're not nearly as good at recommending as real recommender systems. So, there's going to be subroutines that are specialized in those architectures. If we ever get to AGI, which I'm actually fairly skeptical about.
See, I think we're going to get there. When? I don't know. Is it going to be 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? I'm not the best person to ask, maybe.
I think you're actually the best person to ask.
What does that say? But I think like we can just sit and chill. But then there are these like really important problems in front of us today. In my space, solving things like cancer, really curing some of these diseases. These are things that we can literally do, I think, over the next couple of years by pursuing, much more focused AI research in these domains. And I just think that, the opportunity is now to apply lots of these methods that have been, in the dusty academic labs. Now we know that they actually work in the real world, and we can't wait until AGI to actually see that impact, whether it's on, science, health, or the economy.
So one final question. If we meet here a decade from now, what will be most different?
I'm going to be taking a whole concoction of pills that we've developed, curing every ailment, probably still waiting for AGI, perhaps. Yeah.
I think the pendulum is going to shift a little bit away from LLMs and look at AI more broadly. So we're going to be here not asking the question whether we're going to have AGI by just doing token prediction. We're going to be a lot more mature in our knowledge as to what's required to get good AI for what applications. And yeah, it'll be an exciting time, but I don't think we should wait for it. We need to be in the middle of it.
Yeah. And you know, to be serious on AGI, I think this will come, but it's going to happen actually quite gradually. And even things like, you know, the latest announcements that are coming out this week from all the large language models, these are going to feel locally in time quite incremental. But if you just like get to this 10-year chunk of time, I'd love to just look forwards 10 years, and it's going to, you know, the difference is going to be so amazing. Locally, it's probably going to feel like everything's just slowly developing. But in reality, even if you just look 10 years ago, it's like night and day what we can do compared to when I was doing my PhD, for example.
Oh, actually, one more thing on that. So I think science is going to change. Today, science is about making human understandable insights. You publish those insights, and then humans try to apply those to the world. But I saw this already in my work with my then student Vince Konitzer in 2004 in designing optimal selling mechanisms, that there's no kind of analog of, let's say, single item auctions, which is a Nobel Prize winning invention by Roger Myerson, to multiple items. If you're trying to sell multiple items or to maximize revenue, the mechanism itself needs to be computed. And this computational problem, as we proved, is NP-hard, meaning that there is no short theorem that captures how it should be done. And this is going to be true of a lot of sciences, not just economics. In physics, there are a lot of problems that are NP-hard, including many-body problems, for example. And because these are such large theories or theorems, whether they're analytical theorems or experimental theories, humans won't be able to understand them. So what is our publication process going to look like? I'm not talking about long proofs. I'm talking about long theorem statements. And humans will not be able to understand the science. And if we just confine our science to having short human understandable theories, we're going to miss out on a lot of opportunity. But if we accept that we won't be able to understand, what does science then look like? And how do we use that knowledge which nobody understands?
I think that's a very good note to end on. We're honored to have you in Stockholm. This was such a great conversation. Thank you for coming here. So warm applause for Thomas and Max.
Thank you.